The night rain had barely stopped when Sama reached the monastery gate, and in that trembling silence he wondered if running from his past could ever save him, or if the mind simply follows wherever the body goes. The monk who greeted him, Venerable Tissa, did not ask his name or his story, but only whispered, "If you are not the person your thoughts say you are, then who came here seeking peace?" And the question struck deeper than any wound he carried, echoing like thunder in the empty places of his heart, while far away, in a bright modern lab, a woman named Dr. Mira watched the human brain light up with thoughts before people even knew they had them, as if the mind was creating someone he had never chosen to be. And now, standing between ancient wisdom and new science, Sama felt the ground shift beneath the identity he had clung to all his life, leaving one haunting question twisting inside him. If your thoughts build your identity without your permission, then who is the you you've been suffering for? Sama followed Tissa into the quiet courtyard, where the smell of wet earth mixed with early light. And as they walked, the monk spoke softly about how the mind builds prisons out of its own fears, telling him that no storm outside could ever be as violent as the storm a person believes inside. Yet Sama felt a tightening in his chest because he still feared that the person he thought he was could never be forgiven. And the monk simply said, "You suffer because you think your thoughts are you," leaving Sama unsure if he should feel relieved or terrified. As they reached the inner hall, Tissa paused beside an old wooden pillar and tapped it lightly, saying, "The mind is like this wood, shaped by years of weather, but never defined by anyone's storm." And Sama felt something inside him resist, because his thoughts had always screamed the same word, unworthy, and he wondered if a lifetime of believing that could ever be undone by silence. Tissa invited Sama to sit, closing his eyes as he said that the first step to freedom is seeing a thought without becoming it. And Sama tried, but felt flooded by memories he wanted to forget, waves of guilt breaking inside him. Acid. The monk remained still like a mountain, unmoved by storms. Finally, Tissa told him that before he could learn anything deeper, he must answer a simple question. If a thought comes and goes like wind, how can it be who you are? And Sama lowered his gaze, shaken, realizing he had never questioned the voice inside him that had ruled his life. Sama sat beneath the tall sal trees behind the monastery as Tissa told him to watch his thoughts the way one watches clouds drift across an open sky. And though Sama tried to stay still, memories rose like storms. His father's anger, the mistake he could never forgive himself for, the crushing belief that he was nothing more than his past. And yet, as he watched them appear and fade, a strange truth unsettled him. Each thought vanished as quickly as it came, leaving no trace except the one his fear tried to carve. And somewhere far in the modern world, Dr. Mira observed brain scans showing thoughts forming before people even recognized them, as if the mind was an endless river moving on its own. And Sama wondered whether he had ever truly been steering anything at all. As Sama tried to stay present, a memory of his childhood rose sharply. His younger self crying alone in a dark corner after being blamed for something he did not do. And the pain returned with such force that he clenched his fists. But Tissa, watching him, said gently that a thought is not a command and a memory is not a verdict. And the moment Sama heard that the memory seemed to lose just a little of its weight, like a cloud thinning in sunlight. Back in the lab, Dr. Mira reviewed data from a new experiment showing that the brain often creates emotional reactions before the conscious mind even interprets them, and she whispered to herself that identity might be nothing more than a story the mind tells after the moment has passed. While in the forest, Sama opened his eyes slowly, feeling as if the truth was stretching just beyond his reach, close enough to sense, yet too unfamiliar to trust. Tissa crouched beside Sama and asked him what the mind felt like in the moment just before a painful thought appeared, and Sama hesitated because he realized he had never noticed that stillness before the storm, a quiet space he had been too distracted to see. and for a heartbeat he felt something like freedom flicker inside him, so faint it almost vanished the moment he noticed it. Sama closed his eyes again, this time listening carefully, and for the first time he noticed how a thought rose like a ripple in a pond, shaky at first, then louder, then fading on its own, and he whispered that maybe he wasn't the storm after all. Maybe he was the space the storm passed through. And Tissa smiled quietly, knowing Sama had just taken his first real step towards seeing the truth hidden beneath his suffering. Later that afternoon, Sama sat with Tissa on a stone bench overlooking the quiet river, and the monk asked him why he clung so tightly to the name he had been repeating in his mind for years. Coward, failure, disappointment, and Sama felt the familiar sting in his chest because those words had shaped him more than truth ever had. And Tissa said gently that a name is only a shadow, not the person who walks beneath it. Yet Sama feared that without those labels, he would become nothing at all. While somewhere in her lab, Dr. Mira observed how the brain strengthens whatever identity it repeats, whether it brings peace or pain. And for the first time, Sama wondered if the suffering he carried wasn't his nature, but simply a story he had believed too long. Tissa asked Sama to speak one of the harsh names he often called himself, and when Sama whispered it, the word felt heavy and sharp. But the monk only smiled softly and asked him where that word went after it was spoken, and Sama realized it disappeared into the air as quickly as it formed in his mind, leaving him with the shocking sense that a name might hold power only when he clings to it. In the modern lab, Dr. Mira ran a test showing how labels activate emotional circuits instantly, even when they are untrue. And as she watched the data spike, she whispered that the brain believes anything it repeats often enough. And her words echoed across time as Sama stared at the river, wondering how many years he had been letting one painful word define his work. Tissa asked Sama what he would be if he stopped using the stories his fear had written for him, and Sama felt exposed because he had no answer. Only the quiet trembling of someone standing on the edge of a life he had never imagined. And the monk said that identity is a habit, not a truth, and habits can be unlearned one breath at a time. Sama finally asked the question that had been tightening inside him for years. What if the names he carried were the only things holding him together? And Tissa shook his head slowly and said that a person is not held together by fear, but by awareness. And Sama felt a trembling warmth inside him as if something old was cracking open, though he didn't yet know what would grow in its place. As evening settled over the monastery, Tissa led Sama into a quiet hall, lit only by a single oil lamp, and he told him it was time to face the memory he had been running from all his life. The one he believed defined who he was, and Sama felt his heartbeat quicken because he had buried that moment so deeply it felt like opening a wound that never healed. Yet the monk said gently that a memory is not a life sentence, but a visitor, and only by meeting it honestly could he free himself from its shadow. Sama closed his eyes and the memory burst open with painful clarity, the sound of shouting. The moment he froze, the blame that fell on him even though it wasn't his fault, and he felt the old shame tighten around his chest. But Tissa urged him to breathe and watch it like a scene in a play, reminding him that he was no longer the frightened child in that room, but someone watching from the safety of the present. And slowly the memory softened, as if distance had finally broken its grip. At the same time, in her lab, Dr. Mira ran a test showing how the brain replays old pain as if it were happening in the present. And she watched the emotional centers ignite even when the memory was years old, whispering that the mind cannot tell the difference until awareness steps in. And her discovery echoed the monk's teaching as Sama slowly realized he had been living inside the same moment long after it had passed. Tissa then asked Sama to describe the moment again, but this time without using the names he had given himself over the years. And Sama hesitated because the words he usually used, worthless, coward, burden, had always come automatically. Yet when he removed them from the story, the memory changed shape, softer, clearer, kinder. And he realized he had never seen the truth underneath all those labels. Finally, Tissa said that the moment Sama feared most was never the real prison. The prison was the story he kept telling himself about it. And Sama felt something inside him loosen like a knot untying after years of strain. And for the first time, he sensed that the past could exist without controlling him, leaving a quiet space inside his chest where pain had once lived. The next morning, Sama sat alone by the river before sunrise, and for the first time in his life he tried to watch the mind without fighting it, noticing how each thought rose like a small ripple and faded before he could grasp it, and he felt a strange calm settling over him. Not because the thoughts stopped, but because he no longer believed every one of them. And in that quiet space, he sensed a softness he had never known, like seeing the world without the fog of old pain. When Tissa arrived, he did not speak at first, simply watching Sama with a quiet smile. And he finally said that clarity doesn't come from trying to control the mind, but from seeing how little control was needed. And Sama felt a warm gratitude rise in him because for the first time, he realized he had spent years wrestling shadows he didn't need to defeat, only understand. Far away, Dr. Mira studied new imaging data showing that when people observe their thoughts instead of merging with them, the emotional centers quiet down, almost as if the brain recognizes that the thought no longer has authority. And she whispered that awareness itself is the medicine, unaware that in the ancient world, her insight was unfolding in real time through Sama's awakening. Tissa guided Sama into a gentle meditation, telling him to notice the moment just before a thought arrived. And as Sama listened inwardly, he felt a quiet gap. A tiny stillness he had never noticed before, like a doorway opening into a deeper room in the house of his mind, and he realized there was a part of him untouched by fear, untouched by memory, untouched by names. As the meditation deepened, Sama felt the thoughts grow quieter until they became faint whispers, like birds far across the river, and he felt a lightness inside him, as if the heavy story he had carried for years was dissolving into the morning air. And when he opened his eyes, he whispered that he was still here, even without the labels he once believed defined him. And Tissa smiled as if he had been waiting for that realization all along. That evening, the sky turned deep orange as Sama and Tissa walked slowly along the monastery path. And Tissa told him that seeing thoughts clearly was only the beginning, because the deeper truth was that the I that claimed those thoughts was also just another thought. And Sama felt a sudden tremor inside him, as if the ground of his identity had shifted, leaving him standing between who he believed he was and the quiet space he had just begun to sense. And he realized that if the voice in his mind was not him, then everything he had feared about himself might have been an illusion from the start. They stopped beneath a tall tree, and Tissa explained that the sense of is something the mind invents to hold experiences together, just like a story needs a main character. And Sama felt a deep unease, because without that character he didn't know what remained. Yet at the same time a gentle excitement rose inside him, as if he were standing at the edge of a truth too vast to ignore any longer. Meanwhile, in the modern lab, Dr. Mira watched a simulation showing how the brain stitches together sensations, memories, and reactions into a single story called me. And she whispered that the self was never a solid thing, only a process happening moment by moment. And as she studied the shifting patterns, she felt a quiet awe, unaware that her discovery echoed perfectly the truth unfolding in Sama's heart. Back at the monastery, Tissa told Sama to look directly at the feeling of foray inside him, not as a word, but as a sensation. And Sama closed his eyes and searched for it, finding only shifting tension, small movements of breath, and quiet thoughts rising and falling, and the longer he looked, the more the center he always assumed was there seemed to fall apart, leaving nothing solid he could point to and call himself. When Sama finally opened his eyes, he looked at Tissa with a mix of fear and wonder, whispering that the tracing all these years wasn't something he could find anymore. And the monk nodded gently. saying that this was not a loss, but a freedom. Because when the illusion falls apart, what remains is the space where peace can finally grow. And Sama felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of realizing he no longer needed to be the person he once believed he was. The next morning, the world seemed strangely quiet to Sama as he walked with Tissa toward the river, and he noticed how the birds' song, the rustling leaves, and even his own breath felt clearer than ever, as if nothing stood between him and the moment. And Tissa told him gently that when the self stops clinging, the world is finally free to be seen. And Sama felt a peaceful warmth spreading through him because, for the first time, he was not trying to become someone. He was simply here, alive, awake, in a way he had never known. Sama sat by the water and watched a single leaf drift downstream, and he whispered that he finally understood how every thought, every fear, every story he once believed, passing, never truly his. And Tissa nodded, saying that freedom begins when a person stops trying to hold the river still. Then Sama felt a soft smile rise, not from certainty but from the simple joy of no longer fighting the flow of life. In the modern lab, Dr. Mira finalized a report showing how the sense of self dissolves when the brain stops clinging to old narratives. And she looked at the quiet neural patterns with awe, whispering that the mind is freer than anyone realizes. And though she would never meet Sama, her discovery completed the bridge between ancient wisdom and modern science, proving the truth the Buddha had spoken long ago. You are not what you think. As the sun climbed higher, Tissa asked Sama what he saw when he looked inside now. And Sama answered softly that he no longer found a broken person or a frightened child, but an open space, wide and quiet, where thoughts came and went like birds across the sky. And Tissa smiled with deep warmth, knowing Sama had finally stepped beyond the story he once mistook for himself. As they walked back toward the monastery, Sama felt lighter than he ever had, not because life had changed, but because he no longer carried the heavy identity he once treated as truth. And he whispered that he didn't know who he would become from this point on. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. And Tissa replied softly that when a person stops clinging to who they think they are, the world opens like a door that was waiting all along. And Sama stepped forward with quiet wonder, ready for a life no longer ruled by the voice in his mind.